Sup, sup, sup. Do 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 do. I'm live, baby. Live, baby, live. Live, baby, live. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm actually not live on TikTok. Whoops. Good afternoon, guys. We had quite a bit of rain today. My job requires it to be semi-dry, so I got off at like 1 o'clock, dude. Yeah, instead of like 4 or 5. Jeez. So, now that I have some time on my hands, got a couple of book readings to do, guys. Doing some video game history. 50 key video games right here. And so, video game history, and this is on Sandinista Speak about United States imperialism in Nicaragua. So, which one should I read first? What do y'all think? What y'all think? Let's do something fun to start, okay? 50 key video games. And I've been reading games in chronological order. The first game I talked about was a little bit about Oregon Trail from 1971. And I talked about Pong from 1972. And then I've been working my way up. I've made it to the 90s now. The last 3 games I talked about were Doom, Mortal Kombat, and I think Legend of Zelda. So, and I'll let y'all get a little peep there. So, bam. And then there's some more on this page there. So I'm doing a select reading, as you call it, because I want you guys to buy this book yourselves. I don't want to read everything from it. I want you guys to support the authors and editors here. So, and I'm reading games that I played or I'm familiar with. There's games like Diablo, what is this, like King's Quest, Elite, like games that I don't really know much of. So, but now we're getting into the mid-90s when I really took off and started playing a lot of video games, you know? So, the 3 games I'm going to talk about today are going to be Resident Evil, Super Mario 64, and Final Fantasy 7. We've got 3 heavy hitters right here, guys. Oh, I almost dropped the book. 3 games. 2 of those 3 are from my favorite game series of all time. So, let's go to page 216. And talk about Resident Evil 216, baby. All right, so how it works, guys, you flip to the page and it has the game, and it has about 3 to 5 bullet points. And I read like 2 or 3 of them. I don't read every single one because, again, I don't want to spoil this too much. I don't want to read everything. I want you to buy this book because it's pretty neat. All right, so page 216. Resident Evil, 1996. Let's read the introduction. Excuse me. I have to burp. Excuse me. Few are the games that can claim to be the source of the labeling of a subgenre and of a whole gaming trend. This is the case with Resident Evil from Capcom 1996 regarding the action-adventure survival horror genre. Yet Resident Evil was not an innovative game. Rather, the designer Shinji Mikami and his team have used the elements of prior works for their own ends as well as the technological limitations of the PlayStation 1. And the game has set the characteristic features of horror video games. It has literally opened doors to a new emotional experience. And this chapter explains how. Insofar as Resident Evil has been discussed a lot, I'll solely be backtracking here and collecting all the relevant aspects that make it a key video game. Let's read the first bullet point, which is titled An Interactive Horror Movie. Resident Evil might never have made it into history and remained hidden in the shadow of another famed zombie video game released the same year, the arcade light gun rail shooter House of the Dead by Sega. Indeed, asked to make a horror videoludic work to follow Capcom's role-playing game Sweet Home from 1989 on the Nintendo Famicom. And rather than deploying the same top-down view on a maze-like manner, Mikami first wished to design everything in full 3D with a first-person perspective. However, the PlayStation hardware could not render everything in 3D without sacrificing the quality of the graphics, and this was working against his original intention. As Mikami stated, quote, "What I really wanted to do was make a horror movie where you could become the main character and experience all the fear and you could decide what to do. I was aiming for the type of horror entertainment that is not possible in the form of a movie." End quote. The opening cutscene is, as a matter of fact, filmed in live-action footage, and is well known for not being very good. Through dark and shaky images, mostly close-ups and medium shots, the Alpha team from the Police Department's Special Tactics and Rescue Service, STARS, is attacked by ferocious beasts in the forest northwest of Raccoon City, while looking for a previous team gone missing during an inquiry about cannibal attacks. The team is forced to escape into a nearby mansion and to investigate the premises. Although it was created during a time where the interactive movie genre was developing, Resident Evil is not a full-motion video game. It did not propose a branching structure and interactivity reduced to limited and punctual decisions. Opportunely, Mikami went for another design. All right, let's read the next bullet point, which is blind space, blind spots, and doors. Resident Evil's protagonists, monsters, and items were modeled in real-time 3D, while the environment was pre-rendered. This allowed the creation of detailed, gruesome, and sinister locations suitable to the horror genre. Furthermore, Alex Innios asserts, Resident Evil is considered at the time of its release as a Michelangelo ceiling. But such a technique was not new. Although Mikami denied it for nearly 20 years, he did admit it in a Le Monde interview in 2014. And that's in parentheses. Journalists and reviewers of the time did not fail to underline the resemblance. Resident Evil was actually a replication of the schema of Alone in the Dark. This action-adventure French video game designed by Frédéric Raynal in 1992 had groundbreakingly merged 3D polygons for characters, enemies, and items, and pre-rendered 2D images for backgrounds. It had developed filmic, predefined camera angles. It had given the choice between a female or male protagonist, as Resident Evil will, locked in a mansion full of deadly creatures and surprises, and in need of managing an inventory to get out alive. That being said, Resident Evil will not be a simple clone. It will make the videoludic proposition of Alone in the Dark much scarier. The pre-rendering of the settings had two implications. First, the position of the camera presenting the scenes had to be predefined. And second, the virtual space had to be shown in different parts, inasmuch as no camera was yet continuously moving around. Consequently, it is by means of film montage that the spatial articulation had to take place. Like a good movie buff, George A. Romero's zombie flicks were his references. Mikami has used these constraints to his advantage with the aim of exploiting the possibilities of framing and shot assembling. He did it perfectly in a moment now canonical in the annals of scary video games. When Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield, the two playable characters with some variations in their path, cross a corridor at the beginning of their search of the mansion, a change in angle shows them moving away from the camera, while a dog bursts from a window along with loud shattering, wisely framed on the right side and in the foreground of the image. If the player continues running and turns the corner of the corridor, a second dog will appear in a similar fashion, but from the left and with Jill or Chris coming from the back and walking toward it. These two jump scares have set the stage for what it means to play Resident Evil. As one will understand, if there is one term that has been employed to qualify Capcom's game, it is well and truly cinematic, and not just due to the presentation of the cutscenes in letterbox format, one of the first featuring a gruesome zombie turning around in close up toward the player. Similar to the moment just described, and not always from the best position to face a hazard. The camera viewpoints are varied, showing the premises from different distances, the front and the back, the right and the left, a low and high camera angle, the side and the top-down view, and so on. Excuse me. For the player, this entails not knowing how the next location will be visualized and where Jill or Chris will stand in the frame. They therefore were constantly required to scan the new shot and to be attentive. In fact, they had to stay alert. There is one film technique that Mikami will greatly bring into play, namely what Pascal Bonitzer called the blind space. Insofar as a frame inherently leaves its surrounding unseen, the off-screen space became as important as the on-screen. According to Bonitzer, quote, the enemy is virtually everywhere if the vision is partial. The zombies and other bioweapons populating the manor and threatening the STARS agent could effectively spring unexpectedly from any side of the frame. To add to this tension, Mikami went further. Quote, even if you knew before looking around a corner that a zombie was going to be there, we set up blind spots so that players wouldn't be able to see the zombies immediately, and that in turn produced an uneasy feeling that caused players to feel afraid. Close quote. In an opposite manner, the living dead could also be heard before being seen, so as to let the player anticipate a harsh encounter. Another limitation linked to the rendering of the game world has been used in a significant way. The loading screens between areas were presented as movements through the different doors of the mansion, or as taking the stairs. In place of a simple timeout, these transitions built a constant foreboding. In addition to not knowing where the threat could come from, the player never knew what was waiting ahead. Following Poole, quote, perhaps the greatest reason for the game's success is the virtuosic tempo. Periods of wandering through deserted environments with a gnawing sense of unease are interrupted by startling high adrenaline events, close quote. This tempo is due to the fact that Resident Evil is an action and adventure game. Items such as keys, emblems, and crests must be located and collected to be able to progress. The next bullet point is titled Lack of Control, Power, and Means. And the next bullet point says to keep surviving the horror. I'm going to save those for y'all to read on y'all's own. Again, definitely check this book out. I don't want to spoil all of it for you. Alright, so let's move on to the next game. That was Resident Evil. Let's talk about Super Mario 64 on page 257. This is a game that I played at Toys R Us on the demo, you know? And I never owned an SNES or N64 or GameCube, so I'm not too familiar with this game, but everybody knows Super Mario 64, so I think it'd be cool to read about it. So, Super Mario 64, 1996. From 1985 to 1995, Nintendo had delivered 8 games featuring their mascot in super form that defined and popularized the platform genre. Their successful formula of the linear 2D game had evolved over the years to feature new characters, abilities, power-ups, and richer visuals. But in 1996, with the release of Nintendo's new console dawning, the N64, the idea that Super Mario was now going to be in 3D was met with apprehension as well as excitement. How would a 3D Mario game work, given that the proven 2D formula would be incompatible with 3D space? Many speculated that the idea would not work, but as we would learn, the predictions were themselves two-dimensional. As Edge magazine put in the opening of their review in August of 1996, quote, if Nintendo aimed to set itself a tough task, choosing to make the first N64 title a continuation of the most legendary series of video games in history must rank as the most demanding one imaginable. Mario's lineage, after all, is a concertedly two-dimensional one, and hardly ideal material upon which to base what was destined to be the most intensely scrutinized 3D video game of all time. Close quote. As we would learn, Nintendo were not going to simply transfer an old design into 3D. They were going to redefine the game in the genre in the same way as the original. All right, the first bullet point after that introduction was the next generation. Nintendo had already ventured into 3D on the Super Nintendo with the introduction of the Super FX chip in order to deliver Star Fox, a 3D rail shooter. Shigeru Miyamoto, Mario's creator, upon seeing Star Fox, conceived the idea of a 3D Mario game. As the internal name of the Super FX chip was referred to as Super Mario FX, or the Mario chip, there was speculation that Super Mario 64 began as an SNES title. It had not, in parentheses it says, Star Fox programmer Dylan Cuthbert confirmed this to be false. Close parentheses. Design on a 3D Mario platformer began in 1993. Development began a year later. I have an itch. And it was released as intended in 1996 as the N64's launch title. There was a clear intention that Nintendo's successor to the Super Nintendo would be a 3D console and that Nintendo would scale back 3D development on the SNES to create a distance that would aid that distinction. This ultimately resulted in Star Fox 2 from 1996, not being released at the time even though it was completed. Nintendo was not going to be the first to introduce a true 3D platformer to the world. That honor belongs to Jumping Flash from Sony Computer Entertainment in 1995, albeit in a first-person perspective. A year later, in 1996, we would see 3 further 3D platformers arrive on Sony's PlayStation in order to compete with Nintendo's mascot, Crash Bandicoot, Floating Runner, and Bubsy 3D. Crash Bandicoot definitely looked the part. It had the hallmarks of a Mario game with the introduction of a new cartoony character that Sony would use to compete with Mario and Sonic. And the game even featured a level select map reminiscent of Super Mario World. Though Crash Bandicoot was a success, its 3D implementation was somewhat lacking. The game was composed of linear 3D levels and traditional side-scrolling. This was not really Sony's equivalent of Super Mario 64, but it was seen as the main competitor. Floating Runner lacked depth and quality. Bubsy 3D was criticized for its inappropriate controls and for its overall poor transition from 2D to 3D. It had unintentionally demonstrated the very thing that Nintendo wanted to avoid and that players and critics were worried about. Let's see. All right, we're going to skip A Whole New World, that bullet point, and we're going to skip the bullet point Avatar and Player Evolution. We're going to go to Super Mario 64's Legacy. This sounds kind of cool. Next bullet point. Nintendo managed to deliver a magical place to explore and experience when playing Super Mario 64. The new open, non-linear gameplay demonstrated the benefits of freedom, as long as there are things to see and do. Shigeru Miyamoto, the game's director, showed his philosophy of rewarding exploration and consistently providing the player with a sense of accomplishment. The levels invite repeat playthroughs to obtain all 120 power stars. You don't need them all, 70 will finish the game, but you will be pulled in trying to get them all. The game is engaging to play and, unlike previous games, is not just about making it through to the end. Sometimes you just want to spend time in the game and run around like a child in a park playground. Through the third dimension, Nintendo has created a happy place to escape to. The reviews were universally positive, and the game received high praise and high scores across the board. Japan's leading game magazine Famitsu awarded it 39 out of 40. Edge gave it a 10 out of 10. Electronic Game Magazine, 9.5 out of 10. IGN, 9.8 out of 10. And GameSpot, 9.4 out of 10. Delaying the game and console launch was vindicated as Nintendo achieved another killer application on day one. From this game onward, Nintendo had successfully transferred a popular franchise from 2D to 3D, paving the way for others from the era to do the same, proving it can be done despite requiring significant changes, which in this case included evolving the genre from a platformer to include action-adventure. Dan Houser from Rockstar, responsible for the Grand Theft Auto series, freely admits to borrowing from the game, and there are numerous references made in the Assassin's Creed games, a realistic take on the platform action-adventure game. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag director Ashraf Ishmael specifically adds, quote, the best reference I can say for this is effectively like Mario 64. Think about it. You have the castle, which is the ocean, and you have these portals that take you to these really unique worlds where you can come back to these worlds and do a bunch of things. Do collectibles, find stuff that has value for you. That's effectively what it is. But we've taken a much more credible approach to it, obviously. This was the world we decided to build. We wanted a hub world with pockets of maps, and it's really different for Assassin's Creed. And there's an epilogue bullet point, but I'll save that for y'all. So, all right, the third game, let's talk about Final Fantasy VII, probably one of, if not my favorite game of all time. So, 3 great games, guys. So this is on page 110. Let's check it out. I'm really excited, man. This is the first, I think the first Final Fantasy game. Oh. Yeah, man. All right. So, Final Fantasy VII, released in 1997. Let's begin. Since its release by Squaresoft in 1997, the cat is crying. Shut up, cat. Final Fantasy VII's powerful narrative has resonated deeply with players. The technological advancements of the PlayStation afforded the game's developers unprecedented artistic freedom, and the resulting game featured immersive 3D graphics and an extensive storyline. The sweeping cinematic cutscenes that illustrated the game's most significant narrative moments were accompanied by rich symphonic music. Finally, the psychologically detailed character backstories enhanced the player's ability to identify with the characters, heightening the emotional impact of the game's narrative. This chapter examines the relationship between these elements more closely, exploring how the increased technical capabilities of the new console contributed to the emotional intensity of some of the game's most poignant narrative moments. So we've got a few bullet points. Let's see. One is called The Franchise, PlayStation Changes the Game, Narrative Experience, and a conclusion. Dun, 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 dun. All right, let's read The Franchise. That's the first bullet point. Let's take a look. Final Fantasy stands out as one of the longest running and best known video game franchises in history. The majority of main titles in the franchise fall into the role-playing game genre, with the exception of 2 massive multiplayer online RPGs, which are 11 and 14. Additional spin-off games encompass a variety of genres. From fighting games to third-person shooter and tactical RPGs. Originally released for the Nintendo Famicom in Japan in 1987, Final Fantasy's success led to its North American release for the NES in 1990. Releases for several subsequent games in the franchise remain limited to Japanese markets, with the exception of Final Fantasy IV from 91 and 6 in 94. In order to keep naming conventions consistent, Nintendo altered the titles for the North American releases of these games to Final Fantasy II, 1988, and Final Fantasy III from 1990, respectively. When Squaresoft released Final Fantasy VII in 1997, the title remained the same for both international and Japanese audiences, and all subsequent games in the franchise followed suit. Unlike other video game franchises, in which all games tend to share a core universe, each main title game in the Final Fantasy franchise offers a unique game world and experience. Early games featured fantasy plots that generally involved four or more playable characters who worked together to save the world from imminent destruction. Due to the technical limitations of early home gaming systems, games produced for the NES and Super NES relied on pixelated 2D graphics and 8 or 16-bit audio. Later games in the franchise, 7 and beyond, featured plots with more complex philosophical and narrative implications, as well as substantially improved graphics and sound capabilities. Main title games in the series, oh god, sorry, through Final Fantasy X from 2001, share a turn-based RPG format in which players experience random enemy counters while exploring a dungeon or world map. During these encounters, members of the player's party and enemy combatants select actions, attacking using magic items, etc., during their respective turns or complete the battle. Like their narrative worlds, the action options and rules for determining the sequence of turns varies depending on the game. When considering the franchise as a whole, games produced between the mid-90s and the early 2000s transformed the narrative. Artistic and musical expectations for games bearing the Final Fantasy title. Among the games produced during this critical period, Final Fantasy VII remains the most influential, not only within the franchise, but also for the broader RPG genre. Of all the Final Fantasy titles, Final Fantasy VII possesses the most extensive game universe. More spin-off games and films have been created in association with this game than any other main title in the series. With over 13 million copies sold, it is also the highest-selling game in the franchise and the first Japanese RPG to break through to North American markets. In addition, the game's success set the tone for future games in the genre more broadly, helping to establish narrative, cinematic, and gameplay expectations for other RPGs designed for the new console. Let's see here. Okay, let's read the next bullet point, which says PlayStation changes the game. As the first main title to be released for the Sony PlayStation, Final Fantasy VII benefited greatly from the expanded hardware capabilities of the new console. According to creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, the increased artistic freedom allowed by the PlayStation directly influenced Squaresoft's decision to leave Nintendo and produce games for Sony instead. The PlayStation's 32-bit processing power and increased storage of the CD format made 3D graphics using pre-rendered backgrounds and polygonal characters possible for the first time in a Final Fantasy title. Unlike earlier games produced for the NES and SNES, in which the limitations of the hardware influenced decisions on narrative content, the PlayStation achieved Sakaguchi's artistic and narrative vision in full. The result was an RPG with a larger world and more complex narrative presentation than any that came before. While gameplay in Final Fantasy VII remained consistent with prior games in the franchise, the technological leap to the PlayStation resulted in notable shifts in the game's visual and narrative presentation. Its cinematic cutscenes acted as critical anchors for the narrative, illustrating key moments of the story in rich visual detail. Due to the 3D graphics, each CGI cutscene acted like a short movie, drawing players deeper into the story and more closely connecting the narrative experience with gameplay elements. Other changes included the presence of blood and the use of explicit language. Although minor, these additions signaled a shift to a more mature target audience and helped reinforce other narrative content, such as the science fiction setting, which re-envisioned the series in a more modern light. Alongside these striking visual and narrative features, the ability to produce CD quality sound significantly increased the narrative impact of the music, which directly informs players' emotional responses to the game events. In composing the music for Final Fantasy VII, Nobuo Uematsu chose to rely on MIDI, M-I-D-I, which allowed for more dynamic music with fewer repetitive loops and quicker transitions between tracks. With the PlayStation, Uematsu had 24 channels of 16-bit sound at his disposal, far more than the 8 channels available on the SNES. As a result, the soundtrack for Final Fantasy VII featured more complex musical textures and more realistic instrument sounds than those heard in previous titles. A full symphonic score accompanied the game's striking cinematics, and tracks like One Winged Angel, the music associated with the final boss battle, quickly became fan favorites. Alright, the next bullet point is narrative experience in Final Fantasy VII and a conclusion. So I'm going to save my breath for that one. That one seems like a juicy one too, but I'm going to let y'all save that for y'all. Alright, that was today's book reading, select book reading, of 50 key video games. We talked about Final Fantasy VII. We talked about Super Mario 64 and Resident Evil. So a couple of my favorite game series of all time in games. Oh, my cat's crying. One of my 3 cats is crying. All right, I'm going to go pee. Yes, cat. What's your problem? Y'all want to see Snow, the black cat? Come here. Oh, Snow. She hates being picked up. Ah. Come on, baby. Ah. All right. Big baby Snow. All right, let me use the bathroom. Pet this cat for, give me like 90 seconds. We are going to continue book readings today. The next book, cat hair. We're doing United States Imperialism in Nicaragua. If you guys are new to this channel, guys, and you're confused, why on earth are you talking about geopolitics, imperialism, capitalism? That's my passion, guys. This is what I like to do. And I'm combining, gaming, film reviews, and kind of book readings, but like learning about imperialism and capitalism and how it's a detriment to the world. That's what I like to have fun, stay informed. That's kind of the shtick. That's the brand, guys. So give me a few seconds. I'll be right back. Man, I need a haircut bad. All right, guys, I'm back. The cat drank water from the faucet. Maybe that's what she wanted. I know she's got dry food. I don't know what's going on with her, so. All right, so let's read the second book of today, guys. Let's read the second book of today. Dun, 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 dun. Do, 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 do. All right. All right. So let's get to it here. Let's continue our reading of Sandinistas Peak. And this is about a United States in the West imperialism in Nicaragua. Has some cool Latin America too, but specifically Nicaragua. It's got interviews from the leaders of Nicaragua's revolution here. There's their names. And what have we learned so far, guys? The United States installed the Somoza dictatorship in the late 20s, early 30s. They put him in power for 50 years, and they let the country be carved up by the big mega transnational corporations. And while Somoza and his closest friends, family got rich, and they owned most of the land, all the media companies, the goods, the coffee, etc. So, and we've also learned how it gave a little history of how difficult it was for these revolutionaries to organize the masses. It's hard to organize the peasants in the rural areas, and that was the last chapter we talked about. So, and there's a lot of great statistics, guys, how destitute the country was, the literacy rates, the infanticide rates, diseases, education, how everyone was kept in complete poverty. The people were completely ignored under this U.S.-backed dictatorship. So, and on page 43 is where we left off. So, this is the next chapter, guys. And this is titled Nothing Will Hold Back Our Struggle for Liberation by Daniel Ortega. So he's one of the guys in the front there. And then this speech by FSLN leader Daniel Ortega was delivered to the plenary session of the 6th Summit Conference of the Non-Aligned Countries held in Havana, September 3rd through 9th, 1979. Ortega is coordinator of Nicaragua's Junta of National Reconstruction. The translation is by Intercontinental Press. Next paragraph. In January 1928, the Pan American Conference was held in Havana. At that time, the Nicaraguan people were engaged in an unequal struggle against Yankee intervention. Calvin Coolidge, who was then president of the U.S., participated in the Havana meeting, and the tyrant Machado was president of Cuba. Sandino, hoping to gain the support of some delegations, sent the following message on January 2nd, 1928. Sandino was one of the first revolutionaries in the 20s, just FYI. So, quote, "Our voices must be heard in Havana. Men must not lack the moral courage to speak the truth about our misfortune. They must tell how the people of Nicaragua, who are valiantly fighting and suffering, are determined to make any sacrifice, even including their own extermination, in order to defend their liberty. The results in Havana will be null and void if the ideal of the Spanish-speaking peoples is not crystallized. If you let us be assassinated to the last man, we will have the consolation of knowing that we carried out our duty. Our country and freedom." End quote. By A.C. Sandino. Sorry, my phone was buzzing. Anyways. All right, so here we go. I think now this is Daniel Ortega speaking. Not a single voice was raised at that Havana meeting. Today, Havana is serving as the site for the 6th Summit, and the peoples and governments that are represented in this assembly are motivated by common interest. A free and hospitable people, filled with solidarity, is receiving these delegations, and the leader of the revolution carried out by this people is presiding over the non-aligned for this period. The tyrant Machado no longer governs Cuba. It is the people of Cuba who determine their own destiny. The government of National Reconstruction of Nicaragua and the Sandinista National Liberation Front salute the people of Cuba, their government, and the President of the Council of State, Comandante and Comrade Fidel Castro. We also salute the peoples of Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia for the solidarity they demonstrated in support of our cause. On Saturday, September 1st, in a Mexican newspaper, we read a dispatch, Dateline Havana, that made reference to Nicaragua's position regarding the problem of Campuchea. And we say problem because it is a problem for imperialism for a people to be free. The dispatch in question noted that Nicaragua's delegation had aligned itself with the Soviet bloc by recognizing the government of peoples Campuchea. We all know what interests motivate the international press agencies of the so-called free world, so the deed does not surprise us. We know that many of these press agencies, and with them the most reactionary sectors of the U.S. government and of Latin America, are waiting to pounce on our declarations at this meeting. These are some of the forces that gave rise to the Somozaist dictatorship. They are the same forces that defamed and assassinated Lumumba, that defamed and assassinated Che. These are the same forces that slandered and assassinated Van Troy. And that is Nguyen Van Troy, a Vietnamese fighter, by the way. The same forces that slandered and assassinated Sandino. Imperialism cannot conceive of a free people, a sovereign people, an independent people. Because simply and plainly, for them, the people is nothing more than an empty phrase. We just saw reconfirmation of this when our final offensive was launched. They examined the war in mathematical terms. Somoza had a regular army. Somoza had more soldiers than the Sandinistas. Somoza had tanks, planes, artillery, while the Sandinistas didn't. Somoza had more soldiers, more rifles, more communications than the Sandinistas. Therefore, Somoza had to win the war against the Sandinistas. But what was left out was that Somoza did not have the people, and that we Sandinistas were the people. And when Somoza was losing the war, they were talking about Costa Rica intervention, Panamanian intervention, Cuban intervention, Soviet intervention, simply because they have never been able to understand and are never going to understand that people are capable of achieving their liberation, that people are able to solidarize themselves with people, and that therefore the free and sovereign people of Nicaragua today recognizes the right of Campuchea to occupy the seat. Sorry if I'm reading that wrong. I repeat, imperialism cannot understand it because for them the people is nothing more than an empty phrase. The Nicaraguan people have won, with their blood, the right to be here today, in this way breaking with the historic past of servility toward imperialist policy. For the first time in their entire history, the Nicaraguan people can officially express their sovereign will, joining this movement of the non-aligned barely 41 days after their triumph. We are entering the non-aligned movement because in this movement we see the broadest organization of the third world states that are playing an important role in exercising a growing influence in the international sphere. In the struggle of peoples against imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, apartheid, racism, including Zionism and every form of oppression. Because they are for active peaceful coexistence, against the existence of military blocs and alliances, for restructuring international relations on an honorable basis, and are for the establishment of a new international economic order. In the Sandinista revolution, there is no alignment. There is an absolute and consistent commitment to the aspirations of the peoples who have achieved their independence and to those who are struggling to win it. That is why we are among the non-aligned. This transcendental step is part of the process of liberation that peoples are going through. Peoples such as those in Grenada, Iran, Kampuchea, and Uganda, who won beautiful victories this year. In 1855, a certain William Walker arrived from the southern slave states of the United States with a gang of mercenaries to make himself master of our country and all of Central America. The individual in question named himself President of Nicaragua, and his first decree was the reestablishment of slavery. The United States press and more of the few U.S. legislators made William Walker into a hero. In September 1856, after continual and bloody resistance, the people of Nicaragua and the peoples of Central America defeated the invader, who was obliged to flee to his country of origin, where he was received as a hero. Some months later, he again tried to invade our country. During his third attempt, he was captured in Honduras, a country bordering on Nicaragua, and was shot. In 1909, a liberal president named Jose Santos Zelaya, who tried to open new markets in Europe, was forced to resign by a note sent by the U.S. Secretary of State of that time. But what Senor Zelaya lacked, the Nicaraguan people had plenty of, and they rose up against Yankee intervention. Because we reject Yankee intervention, we are in the non-aligned. For that reason, and because we are Sandinistas, we demand the reintegration, the unconditional return of the Guantanamo base to Cuba, and we recognize the heroic and unequal struggle waged by the Cuban people against the criminal blockade. That is why we support the struggle of the people of Puerto Rico for self-determination and independence, and why we are in solidarity with Lolita Lebron and her companions in prison. And this has an asterisk on it. Let's read the footnote at the bottom of the page. Lolita Lebron was one of 5 Puerto Rican nationalists in prison in the U.S. in the early 1950s for armed pro-independence actions. She and the 3 other surviving prisoners were released in 1979. End footnote. They are authentic representatives of the struggle of the people of Puerto Rico. Got it. That is why we stand behind the people of Panama and their struggle for sovereignty over the Canal Zone. That is why we are with the people of Belize in their struggle for independence, for self-determination, and for territorial integrity. Regular troops of the Yankee Marines landed in our country in 1910 in an attempt to suppress our people's desire for independence. Bloody struggles were unleashed, and this armed intervention was maintained until 1926, the year they withdrew, believing the situation to be under control. Because we are Sandinistas and because just causes are our causes, we have, from the beginning, identified with the struggle of the heroic people of Vietnam, and we condemn all the aggressions that have taken place and are taking place against the people and government of Vietnam, which fought and is fighting against aggression and foreign occupation. We also support the just struggle of the people of Western Sahara, and from this moment, Nicaragua must be included among the countries that fully recognize the Democratic Arab Sahrawi Republic and the Polisario Front as the only and legitimate representative of the heroic people of Western Sahara. That is why we recognize the legitimate rights of the people of Nambia, represented by SWAPO, SWAPO. We support the Patriotic Front of Zimbabwe, the sole representative of this people. And we condemn the imperialist maneuvers in Rhodesia, the puppet regime of Muzorewa, Muzorewa, and the so-called internal settlement. This has an asterisk. Let's read the footnote at the bottom. The internal settlement was a plan imposed by the white minority regime in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, to institute nominal black rule while maintaining the economic and political structure of white domination. Abel Muzorewa, a black clergyman, was installed as prime minister under the setup in June 1979. Lacking support from the black majority, the plan collapsed, and after elections in March 1980, Robert Mugabe of the Patriotic Front became prime minister. End footnote. Continue. We solidarize ourselves with the frontline countries and condemn the aggression by South Africa and Rhodesia against them. And we so solidarize with the right of the people of East Timor to self-determination. We support the reunification of Korea, and we demand the withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea. Only a few months were to pass in 1927. Yankee Marines again landed on our soil. Then the future of Augusto Cesar Sandino vigorously rose up and, at the head of an army of workers and peasants, sought to militarily defeat the interventionist forces in an unequal campaign. Sandino embodied the desire for liberty of a people who were systematically subjugated to the attack of Yankee intervention and subjugated to imperialist exploitation and domination. The same Marines who murdered the Filipino people thousands of miles from our country arrived to soak Nicaraguan territory in blood in those days. This explains the existence of Sandinismo, which on May 4th, 1927, gave rise to what Sandino called the, quote, War of Liberators to end the war of the oppressors. The Yankees, who were unable to defeat Sandino's army militarily, who found themselves forced to withdraw in January 1932, again resorted to treachery, using as their instrument an army and an army chief named Anastasio Somoza Garcia, founder of the dynasty. This army and this army chief were created by the White House strategists to assassinate Sandino. They thought that killing Sandino would solve the problem. They did not take into account that Sandino had initiated a process of liberation which, carried on by the Sandinista National Liberation Front, was to win one of the most important victories on July 19th, 1979. On that day, we both defeated the criminal Somozaist National Guard and expelled the last Yankee Marine, Anastasio Somoza, from Nicaragua. Our country is a small country, a poor country. A little more than 2.5 million Nicaraguans live in 128,000 square kilometers. It is a country that is basically dependent on agriculture, and its production was paralyzed by the war. A country that had few factories, which were destroyed by the Somoza Air Force. A country with a small population that has had to sacrifice thousands of its best children to repel 3 armed Yankee interventions that have left more than 200,000 victims. A country that in its final offensive against the Somozaist dictatorship suffered more than 50,000 deaths, a high percentage of whom, 90% of the total, were youth from 8 years to age to 20. A country with its schools and hospitals destroyed, with its cities leveled by 500-pound bombs given to Somoza by the United States and Israeli Zionism. But we were not alone in the struggle. We know that we had the backing of the peoples of the world. We know that this was what made it impossible for the Yankees to carry out a new armed intervention in our country before the tyrant was destroyed. Among the files abandoned by Somozaism, we have found proof of the loans for arms that the government of Israel had given to the dictatorship. Israel was an accomplice to the crimes of Somoza. Israel was the instrument that imperialism used up to the last moment to arm Somoza's genocidal dictatorship. Rockets, rifles, howitzers, planes, gunboats, and even helmets and uniforms were sent to the dictator. But the strength of the people was greater than that of the aggression. As we said at that time, we will not repay these loans, this debt that adds up to millions of dollars. Nor will we pay any debt contracted with other countries for armaments for the Somozaist regime. On the contrary, it is Israel that owes a debt to our people. We are Sandinistas. Our people have been struggling against oppression and interventions for more than 150 years. That is why we have historically identified with the struggle of the Palestinian people, and we recognize the PLO as their legitimate representative. And that is why we condemn Israel's occupation of the Arab territories and demand their unconditional return. We support genuine efforts in the search for a just and true peace in the Middle East. But such a peace must take into account the interest of all the parties, and in the first place the rights of the Palestinian people. On May 4th, 1927, at the moment Sandino was rising up, a Nicaraguan traitor signed away the sovereignty of the people of Nicaragua to the Yankee government in exchange for $1 for each rifle turned in. We condemn the Camp David Accords, which, like the shameful treason in 1927 Nicaragua, merit our energetic repudiation. In June 1979, there were forces in the U.S. government that wanted to propose an invasion of our soil to the 17th meeting of representatives of the Organization of American States. But there were also 17 Latin American countries that said no to the imperialist proposal. Here we must make special mention and take recognition of the Andean Pact and countries. We should mention the names of President Rodrigo Carazo of Costa Rica, ex-President Carlos Andrés Pérez of Venezuela, President José López Portillo of Mexico, General Omar Torrijos of Panama, and Fidel Castro of Cuba, all of whom were and continue to be in solidarity with our struggle, despite the risk that such solidarity implies. We should make special mention of the militant solidarity that Latin American fighters gave our struggle. The blood of these fighters was shed along the road to victory. We can state that Latin America helped to make this victory possible. We are a small country that has waged war in order to win peace, and we support the establishment of a just and lasting peace that extends to all countries and regions. We recognize the right of peoples to win their freedom through the path that is best for them, whether armed or not. We are a poor country that wants to take the efforts and resources now being invested in defense of the revolution and invested in tractors and plows. We support general and complete disarmament under strict international control. We are for an end to the arms race, and we salute the SALT II Accords as an important step in this direction. We demand respect for the territorial integrity of states and renunciation of the use of force in international relations. We condemn the existence of military bases. Sandinismo is the incarceration of the nation. No, the incarnation of the nation, sorry. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, as the genuine vanguard of the great people's insurrection that defeated the dictatorship, is now pushing forward a process of national reconstruction, whose first measures have been the massive expropriation of the property of Somoza and his civilian and military accomplices. So far, more than 500,000 hectares, close to 50% of the entire arable area of the country, has been recovered by the people. More than 180 industrial and commercial enterprises have passed into the hands of the people. More than 400 mansions and homes have been expropriated in the interest of the people. The banks have been nationalized. We have begun to put an integral agrarian reform plan into effect. Agricultural exports have been nationalized. The exploitation of national resources have been nationalized. By eliminating the 500 and 1,000 Cordoba bills, which is US 10 cents, and retiring them from circulation, we are hindering the maneuvers of the defeated Somozaists to destabilize our country financially. A real social thrust is being given to education, health, and housing. A foreign policy of relations with all countries of the world has been established. We have become part of the movement of the non-aligned. Sandinista defense committees have been organized as bodies of people's participation. The Sandinista People's Army has been set up to fulfill the pressing need to guarantee the defense in advance of the revolution. And this revolution has been expansive and generous towards its enemies. Thousands of captured soldiers have had their lives protected. Groups such as International Red Cross were authorized to set up centers of refuge to give shelter to the Somoza's criminals who are fleeing. The revolution is marching forward. The difficulties are great. The counter-revolution is a potential threat. There are some who assert that we are assassinating the prisoners. There are some who are trying to put conditions on international aid. The conspiracy is powerful, and the most reactionary sectors of the U.S. government have already succeeded in stopping a small grant of $8 million that the U.S. government was going to give our country. The most reactionary sectors of the Central American region are observing our process with trepidation. We have detected concentrations of Somoza soldiers in neighboring countries. But just as we have been generous in victory, we will be inflexible in defense of the revolution. To what has already been described, we must add the economic legacy of imperialist domination in the Somoza war of aggression. We find ourselves with a foreign debt of more than $1.53 billion. Of this amount, $596 million falls due this year, having been incurred as short-term loans at very high interest rates. The foreign debt is equivalent to 3 times the annual exports of this country. The loans obtained by Somozaism were misspent, squandered, and sent out of the country to personal accounts in the United States and Europe. A study published by August 14th by the Economic Commission for Latin America, CEPAL, maintained that Somoza's bombing resulted in $580 million in material damage to the physical and social infrastructure in the agricultural, industrial, and commercial sectors. At present, $741 million is needed to reactivate production. To the losses cited above, we have to add the losses to the system of production that stem from the paralysis of economic activities. In addition, we must add the resources required for restoring the country's economic apparatus at a time when it is also being transformed. To give us a more graphic representation of the problem, CEPAL estimates that the situation we have described means that the gross domestic product has declined 25% this year, 1979. In per capita terms, this puts the GDP back to the level that Nicaragua was at in 1962, meaning we have slid back 17 years. And to top it all off, our revolution found only $3.5 million in the state coffers. That is all that Somozaism was unable to loot. $3.5 million. Nicaragua's situation has provoked interest in the countries of Latin America and the rest of the world. Regional bodies have expressed a decision to aid us. Bilaterally, we have close relations with many countries. But we must be frank. The oppressive financial problem that confronts our process, which is directly related to restructuring the foreign debt and receiving financing in order to allow our economy to start up again, does not seem to seriously interest the developed countries. The government of Mexico, which has aided us to the extent it is able, has raised the idea of an international sale of solidarity bonds that would come due at a deferred period with low interest. Through this bond issue, the debt that falls due this year, which as we said totals $596 million, would be restructured on adequate terms. We support the proposal of President Didier Rattacat of Madagascar regarding the creation of a financial fund of the non-aligned countries. We believe it is our duty to present before the movement of the non-aligned both the advances and the problems of the revolution in Nicaragua. We believe that by consolidating the Nicaraguan revolution, we will be strengthening the struggle of the underdeveloped countries. We know that imperialism is interested in seeing our process fail and that it is going to use all the resources at its disposal to achieve that. The liberation struggle in our country is continuing. And today, more than ever, we need the disinterested support of the non-aligned. Nicaragua, which 41 days after its triumph is showing you both the open wounds and the consolidation of our revolution, is a challenge for this movement. The people of Sandino are not going to step back from the ground already gained. Our integration with the peoples of Africa and Asia raises our morale in this great battle. The future belongs to the peoples. The march toward victory will not be stopped! Exclamation point on that one. End quote. In speech that was by Daniel Ortega. All right, guys. That was I got pretty into that one. I enjoyed that. The next chapter is an interview with Humberto Ortega titled Nicaragua, the Strategy of Victory. And that's page 53. This book is about 150 pages long. So, bam, there you go, guys. That was the next chapter in Santa Needs to Speak. Isn't that nuts, guys? It's not just the United States. It's NATO countries. It's Israel. Israel helps the United States and the West overthrow governments in Latin America, all over the world, guys, all over the world. And that's something they work on every hour, every minute of the day, every second. How can capitalism thrive? How can capitalism be on full throttle every second of the day? That's what the U.S., Israel, NATO countries, they're all in cahoots, guys. So, all right. Well, that's today's book reading. I have a doctor's appointment in 20 minutes, so I'm gonna go do that. But I'm at the end of Jill Valentine's run in Resident Evil 1 Remake, an all-time favorite game of mine. I died versus Lisa Trevor yesterday. I was pretty upset about it, and I quit after just an hour of streaming because I didn't want to backtrack the 10 or so minutes. But I'm going to continue that later today, guys. And guys, I also have some Alana Pierce. She gets Content Creator of the Year awards. She's like the blonde Australian gamer content creator. Um, we're not beefing, but I responded to her. She has a video about how X is horrible, and there's like AI generated I don't know what I can say online, but it's like it's not good. It has like AI generated stuff of like kids and stuff, and and she's just saying like, "Oh, get off Twitter. There's absolutely no reason to stay." And I'm countering with that because, like, guys, there's like tons of good creators. There's journalists. There's indie media. There's people that are suppressed on there that are doing their damnedest to get heard, reporting on stories that need to be heard. And to tell them to shut up and get off and be silent. I mean, I know she's like saying, "Oh, you can just post in these other places." I disagree with all that. You need to post as much as you can across all platforms at all times. That's my um, position. So I'm gonna make a whole video about that. I'm gonna show this whole Blue Sky thread with the replies. I got receipts, yo. So I hope y'all will stay tuned for that. That'll be like my news. I got to do my news headlines here soon. So, all right, guys. Well, I'll check you guys later.